Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Beth Webster, and it's my pleasure to chair tonight's Tom Spurling Oration. I'd like to acknowledge that this event is being held on the traditional lands of the First Nations people. In my case, it's the Bunurong and Bunurong people, but for people in the northern part of Melbourne, it's the Wurundjeri people. With you, I'd like to pay our respects to their elders, past and present. If you have any questions tonight for Professor Burry, can you please enter them into the Q&A bar at the bottom of your screen, and I'll read them out at the end of the oration. For those of you who wish to share this evening's presentation, please use the event hashtag #TomSpurlingOration and the CTI Twitter handle @CTI Swinburne. I'd now like to invite Professor Pascal Quester to open the oration.
Well, thank you, Beth, and welcome everyone to today's special event. I'd like to make a special welcome to Philip Storer, CEO of the city of Boroondara, where our Hawthorne campus is located and where I'm speaking to you from, Lisa Gamboni, Chair of Swinburne Smart City Board, and Tim Black, founder and owner of BKK Architects. Thank you for your ongoing support for our research efforts in innovation, technology, and urban living and design. Research, science, and technology, together with an understanding of human behavior, can lead to the development of new models for a workforce and innovation ecosystem. At Swinburne, we look for strong internal collaboration and partnerships with industry, communities, government, and other tertiary institutions to co-create transformative technology solutions and influence policy to shape social transformation. This is at the heart of Swinburne's vision, to bring people and technology together to build a better world. And it is through those great partnerships, innovative thought, and technological application that we can genuinely make a big difference in the world. One of the key focuses of our research community is decoupling economic growth from accelerated use of materials. We research smart and sustainable cities to bring together smart energy management, clean energy, low carbon mobility, and design. This is fundamental to creating an innovative planet, a planet that is environmentally sustainable thanks to the research, innovation, and technology working in harmony to enable new and sustainable solutions. And this is central to Swinburne's Horizon 2025 strategy. Within Swinburne's research community, it is encouraging to see our industry connection, entrepreneurship, design thinking, and innovation leading to sustainable commercial outcomes. When industry and community partners turn to universities for solution and innovative and future innovation, they also seek the human capital and the talent that is required to help drive their knowledge outcomes. As industry leaders around the world become increasingly aware of the potential effects of climate change on business operations, as has been highlighted in this month's COP26 conference, greater concern for social purpose and environmental impact are clear. And as a university with multiple campuses and a global footprint, and one that is absolutely committed to be carbon neutral by 2025, we are acutely aware of these issues as the world slowly reopens post-pandemic. More importantly, we are acting, not just talking. And speaking of action, I'm very pleased to have been able to that we've all been able to come together today, albeit virtually, to continue the tradition of knowledge sharing as part of the Tom Spurling Oration. Professor Tom Spurling AO has an outstanding ability to understand how good science is leveraged by entrepreneurial people and efficient institutions. Science on its own does not impact our lives. It needs someone to see the potential, develop a business case, win over collaborators, and have a vision for where it fits into the established value chains. To this end, Professor Spurling has been instrumental in driving research about the determinants of trade and global value chains, creating business intelligence tools to uncover new technologies and existing communities, identifying connections across innovation systems and networks, analyzing what makes good innovation and intellectual property policy, and documenting the history of Australian scientists. Professor Spurling is one of the driving forces of innovation at Swinburne University, and he has been instrumental in the area of science and innovation for over 55 years, which makes you about 56, Tom, correct? We are so fortunate to have him at Swinburne to share his expertise in science and innovation, as well as his ability to translate research into commercial products. Perhaps Professor Spurling is best known for his role in developing and commercializing the polymer banknote. You know, this cash that you can leave in your pocket and put through a spin of the washing machine and still find intact at the end of even the hot cycle. This technology is now used in over 30 countries. Talk about impact, talk about social impact. In 2017, he was awarded the prestigious Australian and New Zealand Association for the Advancement of Science Medal for his contributions to science. And Tom's work continues today. He's researching the evolution of the CSIRO since World War II and the main factors that have driven changes in organization. As a close partner of Swinburne's Victorian Hydrogen Hub and our recently launched Aerostructures Innovation Research Hub, or HAIR Hub, CSIRO is part of the fabric of Australia's science, research and technology landscape. In a few moments, Tom will introduce our keynote speaker for tonight, Professor Mark Burry. And I think a line from Mark Swinburne's bio says it all. His role is to lead the development of a whole of university research approach to help ensure that our future cities anticipate and meet the needs of all. Engage smart citizens for engaging smart cities. I think Melbourne is currently looking at what it means to be a smart city at the time where people are reinventing the coffee culture. With more than 4 decades of in-depth involvement with Antoni Gaudi's work, I'm sure today we'll just scratch the surface, but nonetheless will be an enriching insight into a quite extraordinary body of work. As you listen today, I encourage you all to be curious and continue to support the work of our researchers. Consider the way in which you, your work and your organization can contribute to Swinburne's vision of bringing people and technology together to build a better world so that we can deliver it for you. Thank you very much and enjoy the night. Over to you, Tom, I think.
Thank you very much, Vice-Chancellor, for your generous words. It's a great privilege for me to be part of this event, which, as you say, celebrates all the characteristics of your vision for the university. I was very thrilled when I heard that Mark Burry had agreed to give the 2021 oration. My wife Heather and I first met Mark in 2011, just before we were going to visit Barcelona on a trip to Spain. It was at a talk about the Sagrada Família, and Mark introduced us to the Sagrada Família, but in discussions after his talk emphasized 2 things. The first was that photographs can't capture experiences, and the second thing he said was that no one can prepare you for the experience as you walk into some spaces. He was certainly right with respect to when I walked into Sagrada Família. I'll never forget the experience of color, light, and sound of that moment. Earlier this year, I had a very similar experience that the Gija peoples of the northwest of Western Australia have been experiencing for more than 20,000 years. This was when I walked into the Cathedral Gorge in the Poonaloo area of the northwest of Western Australia. The colour, the light, and the sound of that moment will stay with me forever. I recommend that once you can travel to Western Australia, that you go and visit the Cathedral Gorge, a marvellous part of the country. But Professor Mark Burry has not only had these experiences, he's helped create them. He graduated with a BA in architecture from the University of Cambridge in 1979, and after that he went on a backpacker tour of Europe and visited the Sagrada Família in Barcelona. He introduced himself to the architects and builders on the site and volunteered to assist in completing the basilica. The construction committee at the time was so impressed with his work that they awarded him a 12-month scholarship to study the surviving fragments of Antoni Gaudí's model of the nave in order to produce working drawings. In 1989, the new management of the building brought together a team of 6 architects, including Mark, whose task was to design and build the naves. Mark has had continuous contracts with the construction committee until September 2016, when he completed the design of the Sagrada Família Glory facade based on Gaudí's 11 surviving model fragments and 5 surviving photographs. During this period, Mark has served as an executive architect and researcher for the project. During all the years that Mark has worked on the Sagrada Família, he has simultaneously pursued an academic career. His first appointment was at Victoria University of Wellington, then as Professor of Architecture and Building at Deakin University, Professor of Innovation at RMIT University, Professor of Urban Futures at the University of Melbourne, and now we're very lucky in Swinburne to have Mark as the Director of the Smart Cities Research Institute. In 2018, Mark was appointed an Officer of the Order of Australia for his distinguished service to spatial information architecture as an academic, researcher and author, and as an innovator in the application of digital manufacturing and construction methods. So with that, it's my great pleasure to invite Mark to deliver the 2021 Tom Spurling Oration.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Beth. And thank you to the CTI for inviting me for this occasion. Before I start, I'll just make my acknowledgement to the Burundjeri people, the Kulin Nation, who are traditional owners of the land in which Swinburne Australian campuses are located in Melbourne's east and outer east, and pay our respect to their elders past, present and emerging. And I'm giving this oration from Swinburne today. When I was so flattered to be invited to give the Tom Spurling Oration, because Tom has been a mentor for so many years for exactly the reasons that were talked about at the beginning. And I was trying to think how I could combine 2 things in one hit, particularly quite a short hit. So I think I've got 35 minutes to talk about Antoni Gaudí, technology and urban futures. It's a bit out of order to try and do this because I can't do any of them justice in half an hour, let alone all 3 of them. But what I want to get across tonight is that a complex architectural project, and I'm an architect, as we heard, so that's my millstone or my privilege. The Sagrada Familia has something in common with planning for sustainable urban futures, and that is reaching high and competently mitigate risks. The innovations required to bring Antoni Gaudí's design of liberated organic architecture to fruition expose the need to collaborate and embrace the technology of the day. This is curious because he actually argued that you should never build beyond the means and knowledge that you already have. He was very innovative in terms of design, but very conservative but in terms of what he chose to build with and how. But he himself had to adapt. We can look at the Sagrada Familia and think about cities which should be designed with people, not just for them. And in exploring this project, which has taken 144 years to its expected completion date in 2026, we have the value of his shared expertise has been revealed to include a lot of people, including planners, urban designers and engineers, sociologists, geospatialists and economists. And as I'll show later, that's just a small sample of people who are responsible for helping us get where we want to with our urban futures. There's a core proposition around technology that is required around new conversations if we get our urban experts to a point where they can reach similar heights as Gaudi. I think there's room for improvement. And I'm also wanting to cover the emerging urban technology that brings us together in exciting new ways and facilitating a richer participation from people most affected by the decisions of experts, which are the citizens. I am not an expert PowerPoint user, and it looks like only my mouse can work. I'm going to go backwards. There's a caveat. This is a high level and a high speed glide over Gaudi technology and urban futures. I come from a visual culture, so I've got a lot of slides to show, and I hope I can keep my words to the minimum so we finish in time. And no doubt I'll be touching on some touchy topics, but any implied critique is potentially around policies and their formulation, not politics per se. So let's start with the plan of Barcelona, because Barcelona has one property that, for me, that it does glue together the idea of the future city and the role that really adventurous visionary architects like Gaudi can offer. And that's because in my last year of studying, it's a 5-year course for architecture, I wrote a thesis on the visionary ideals that led to Barcelona being such an extraordinary city. I imagine a lot of people listening tonight will have been to Barcelona. I haven't met anybody yet who's not enchanted by it. There's so much on offer, and we're inclined to think what happens in Barcelona can only stay in Barcelona, but I wish we would find ways to bring more of this amazing texture to us. There's the equivalent view of our city. It's all very clear. We've got a grid in the middle, and we have lots of outlying areas where factories are. And most of all, to my eyes, this fantastic quantity of green space, which we are so privileged to have. Particularly when we look at the centre of Melbourne, it has the urbanity that we expect of a modern, thriving city. And it's not marvellous Melbourne for a reason. So Sagrada actually was the architect, although he's an engineer, for the layout of Barcelona, that what gives it such a distinctive look. And in 1959 was given the task, first of all, to survey the area outside the city. As you can see on the slide on the right, when you expand a city, you consume all the wonderful arable land. In the case of Barcelona, it would have been cultivated for centuries, and that's the land that becomes the new city. It's bizarre. We do it too. We can see it happening to the west and to the north of Melbourne. He was asked to find out where the opportunities were for growth, because it was impossible for the city to stay within the city walls. And he came up with this fantastic plan based on a theory which is Polycentric Egalitarianism. The idea was that Barcelona would not have a center, and to this day, it still doesn't have a CBD like most cities. It's polycentric and egalitarian because everyone was supposed to be able to walk to all the services they need, the schools, the shops, the hospitals, and their friends. And originally, you can see from the plan on the right, he separated the pedestrian infrastructure from the vehicles. So the vehicles were going up down the streets in one way. But if you can see the lighter hatching between each block, that was meant to be parkland. And the idea was that you'd filter your way through. It started off well, it didn't quite complete. But the other great innovation was that he actually put all the railways underground, even at that date. So there's no level, grade level crossing removals required for Barcelona because they're already there. He coined the term urbanization, so urbanism, which is a fantastically wide discipline. It's not a single discipline. It involves everybody from who has an interest in how cities are created and evolve and function. And he made this 3-volume collection, which he eventually published in 1867, which is include maps. It's a book full of tables because he was one of the first ever to actually use statistics by measuring the city and how it functioned to work out what was the best plan for Barcelona. 3 architects won the competition for the extension of the city, but in fact they were ignored, and it was the engineer's plan. He even thought about how trams, everything was all thought through. Yet when you look at it now, this isn't quite the Barcelona that he'd planned. It is polycentric. It's reasonably egalitarian, but it certainly doesn't have the separated pedestrian and vehicle infrastructure that he wanted. The image on the right-hand side is Valencia, just to show that Barcelona is not the only fabulous city in Spain. Valencia has a river that used to flood, like a lot of rivers do, but instead of just sucking on it, they actually diverted it in the 1980s, 1990s. Now the center of Valencia has this elongated park running through the center. You can see, you can read the modern city with the medieval city in the core, and you can read this brave decision of diverting a river to make this linear park down the middle. So Gaudi, what can we learn from him? I thought Gaudi architect plus because he was the original polymath. He's the only person that I would regard as genius that I've personally been associated with, albeit posthumously, through looking at his work. It was nothing he couldn't do other than finish his buildings on time and on cost. But I think that's a small detail for an architect of such caliber. Haven't got time to give you a tour through his work, but even just taking a townhouse like this one for his patron, Sebi Guel, one of his first projects. So he was now qualified about 10 years. He was already out showing that he was pushing the boundary in every way possible, structurally, philosophically, light, heating, air. Even this building had a natural air conditioning system for the stables down below. But it's important to realize that Gaudi isn't some kind of freak or anomaly. He was actually in a very fertile time for architectural and cultural production. You can see here the Hospital San Pau, which are the 3 slides to the left, where that's the ward you're looking at in number 3, where you had cross ventilation. So the hospital was considered as pavilions. It still exists today, and it's a great place to visit. And if you want to hear Wagner and all his splendor, then there's nothing better than the Palace of Music, the Palau de la Música, in the center of the city. But one project defines Gaudi. This is what I regard as his best work. It's not his most important work, which is Sagrada Família, which I'll explain, but it's his best work because it's the quintessential Gaudi who actually understood the forces of nature, and that the architect and the engineer at least would have to come together if you're going to build a building that is going to be performed optimally with these forces. So he designed the building as a model upside down. So you can see it here. Little bags of bird shot representing the weight of the building, so that he could see gravity itself describe the form of the building. Once it finished, and I must say it took about 10 years for this model to be constructed, it was painstaking. You can see on the left-hand side, he just took a photograph, an example of Gaudi having to go into modern technology against his better judgment in order to photograph it, so that he could actually produce the client representation. So the client, it's an undrawable building, which is what drew me to Gaudi in the first place. In this case, he's photographed the buildings and then painted over them after 10 years to give the client a sense of what they're getting. And then from the point of view of the builder, the same model, which was constructed in a shed next door to the site, just outside Barcelona, at a scale of 1 to 10, the builders could just measure off the model and build the building. And when you see the interior, it is just extraordinary. I'd love to talk about it in detail, but every single line of structure you're seeing here is meeting the forces that's designed to accommodate head on. There's no axial forces being transmitted whatsoever. And just one other thing to note that in this building, there's not one piece of steel or concrete. This is all just stone and brick laid using the time-honored Catalan vaulting technique. Just one sensational space, but unfortunately just the basement, because this is one of Gaudi's several heroic failures. After 16 years on the job, the client, who became infirm, his children decided that this wasn't going anywhere fast. When you look at the actual fabric of just this basement and the fabulous space of the crypt, you can see that enough was built for us to have a spine-tingling recognition that this is what genius looks like when you're trying to build sustainably. He's used brick only where it's required. You can see the lines of force where he's using a very modest amount of brick, and everywhere else he's used clinker, which is the byproduct of bricks that have been overfired. Even the windows, you can see, are conceived as butterfly wings. There's the outside and the inside. And in terms of sustainability, he's also using the needles from the corduroy factory, which is what the little church was associated with when they were discarded. Instead of throwing them away, he had craftspeople make them into these wonderful grills. But this is the slide. This is the fundamental spatial design paradigm shift that he brought to us, which is to think about what happens when you design something so complex that an individual can no longer have successful carriage of it. He must realize towards the end of his life that he had far too many wonderful works that weren't finished, not least the Sagrada Familia. And another thing to realize that he was in his time. He wasn't of his own. He wasn't some freak. Theo van Doesburg in 1924 wrote this fantastic manifesto about the new architecture. He includes in architecture's next phase of development, the ground floor plan must disappear completely. The two-dimensional spatial composition fixed in a ground plan will be replaced by an exact constructional calculation, a calculation by means of which the supporting capacity is restricted to the simplest but strongest supporting points. For this purpose, Euclidean mathematics will be of no further use. But with the aid of calculation, this is non-Euclidean and takes into account the 4 dimensions. Everything will be very easy. I didn't put everything will be very easy in red because that was exactly the problem. It wasn't. But it certainly was a fantastic shift from two-dimensional plan to 4-dimensional thinking. And that is what has been gifted to us as architects today with this wonderful invention of computers as digital agents to assist our creative energies. The indulgent client, many factors contribute to Gaudi's uniqueness. His client, Güell, gave Gaudi complete liberty to set up this building laboratory to test his new approaches to design. The architect had throughout the years developed new methods of working which gave him initial unconventional 3-dimensional answers obtained with the help of scale models and full-size mock-ups, and without using the drafting table technique and its consequent limitations. We may say that the Ecological chapel, which is what this piece refers to, was not conceived or born as an ordinary building would be in any architect's office. So you can imagine as a young architect setting out, what was being offered here by Gaudi was a way to completely rethink the way we design buildings and how we translate them into construction. And that's what we do when we learn from the Sagrada Familia. The Sagrada Familia is not his best building, in my humble opinion, but it's certainly his most important building because of the fact that it had to be continued so long after his death without him there to help us. Just making sure my time is working. I'm hoping you're all familiar with it. That's what it looks like from the outside. I'd like to say that it was a building that took him some years and iterations. It wasn't, he wasn't the original architect. He left in the end some plans that were destroyed in the Civil War of 1936 and comprehensive 1:25 and 1:10 scale models, which have now been translated into this incredible space. These are photographs that are really designed not to give you the experience of being there, but to give you a sense that if you haven't been there, then you should go as soon as you possibly can. The interior effectively is completed. He conceived of it as a forest with great columns, which are the trees and branches reaching up to the light. And we can see this play out in the tectonics of his decision-making. It's got colored glass along the 2 lower floors, but the upper floor is white glass. So you get this heavenly white light way above, 30 meters and above in the space. So my initiation there, this is my work integrated learning of 1979, 1980, where I worked with the 2 gentlemen on the left who knew Gaudi when they were young architects helping raise money for the project and going to the site where Gaudi would give descriptions of his latest discoveries. You notice in that quote I just read from Puccio Boada, who's this gentleman here, that all of Gaudi's buildings were living laboratories. And hence, from my point of view, it was a WIL experience without equal. I had to rethink everything I'd done at school. Nothing that was being asked of me at this time was something that was familiar. I was being presented with these pieces of broken model and asked to extract the geometry from them, because that's what the 2 90-year-old architects, my bosses, were able to bring to the party. They knew that he had a system, but nobody up to that point had a chance to unravel it. And unraveling it only came when I took my architect's hat off. I put on that of a geographer and realized that I wasn't drawing these models, I was mapping them. And so I realized that I'd understood the geometrical consequences of surfaces which intersect in space. 2 surfaces intersect with ridges, and 3 ridges will intersect at a peak, known as a triple point by the mathematicians. And you can see on the slide on the right, that's exactly what I had to do. For our Vice Chancellor, I'm sure she'll be pleased to understand, if you didn't know already, that Gaudi learned all his descriptive geometry from Leroy. This was the classic text for his time. 1/6 of an architect's training in the 19th century was learning all about descriptive geometry, and Gaudi uniquely understood the value of this geometry, which have lines in space which intersect on points. So any point on the surface will have 2 straight lines going through it. This means, in a nutshell, it's easy or easier to describe to someone building it what they have to do. I have an animation which I really don't have time to play, but I will do so anyway because it shows the theory. Gaudi was thinking in 4 dimensions. These surfaces aren't fixed when they're made in stone. They're implicitly derived from these hyperboloids of revolution. He saw them as fundamentally as sculpting. So even though we're using a computer here, we're actually crafting the surfaces by sculpting away from the notional stone. But of course, I didn't have computers then. I had to use think on my feet. So I was using descriptive geometry, thinking of as a map maker, not as an architect. I had the legacy of the model makers who had been using Gaudi's own method for making models, which was Gaudi's way of working. This translated eventually into digital design, and I'll skip that video, and I will skip that video. I hope it's intriguing. And this one, which I'm going to skip too, it's also intriguing, but you can see this is what Gaudi was doing in his head, this fantastic ability to sculpt in 4D. That's why I'm certain that he's a genius, because I haven't met anybody with ability approaching that at all. This is a collection of these surfaces, all joining together to form the crossing over the center of the building. But it's been this extraordinary journey over 38 years, because as the digital has intervened, every opportunity we have brought it in as pioneers, but it was always behind the force of getting the building built. So we actually translated his model making technique to one-to-one in order to make the molds to build the artificial stone. And also we had to translate these computer drawings into practical information. And you can see here just very quickly, the straight lines that describe the geometry are being deployed to build the formwork for the traditional Catalan vaulting. And down on the bottom right, you can see that these geometries even have the most optimal arrangement for structure, because this is reinforcement, which is going exactly along the lines of the geometry, but also the lines of force. And there we have it. The passion facade was when we started stepping beyond the modeling. We had to work from just this one drawing. And as you can see in the middle, we always begin with the sketch. We've never thrown away the pencil for the computer. But at each time, we think of new ways to work. You can see here, the only drawing of relevance is the one in the center, which is the schema, which explains to the computer scientists we're working with how this parametric, that's a flexible model, would be constructed so that we would be using Gaudi's surfaces exclusively with no fudging. This is actually mathematically very sophisticated. Also very controversial, because we didn't know how these columns would be seen. So again, another shout out to France, because we went to Perpignan, where they had a machine that could carve polystyrene for us. This is in 2005, very hard to source that technology. Now, of course, it's abundant, only 16 years later. We had a polystyrene column made at full scale, which was then painted and put up on top of the passion facade, so we could see it for years. Another shout out to France. You'd think there's some sucking up going on, but it's just true. This is Katia from Dassault Systems. We couldn't use architectural software for this project at all. We had to go to engineering for aeronautical and ships and vehicles. And you can see on the left, the model by Jane, my partner, and on the right, the outcome of a 100% parametric version of our design for the passion facade. So the first use of parametric modeling in any architectural project, and certainly the first use of robots for cutting stone, as you can see for the production. Oh my goodness, this is also interesting. This is a granite from Tarn, central France, which is the source of the best granite possible for this purpose, even though it's the wrong color. We wanted a golden color, but we had to go for the gray. This is because these columns are actually 9.5 meters tall, and you can see them in place there and the completed facade. I don't know how we would have done this without the intervention of this technology. Columns, another story. The columns, Gaudi didn't use the hanging model for the Sagrada Familia, but he fully resolved the structure, even though he's only an architect. And you can see these surviving drawings, which were published 2 years after he died. Finite element analysis many decades later showed that we didn't have to do anything different from what he had proposed. So we built exactly what he drew in before he died. And on the right-hand side, the consummate engineer, he's actually testing the bearing strength of the various stones. You can just see down here with a machine that he invented himself. It's not that he didn't trust anyone, I just think that was the only way he could do it. I'd love to tell you all about these columns, but what you need to know is that they look abstract in terms of their sculpturing, but of course there is some geometry underlying them. They're playing out here. On the, too big a story, but we'll show the video for this because it does attempt to give you a sense of that this isn't accidental. For instance, the 8-pointed column is 2 squares which are opposed by 45 degrees. You have a concave and a convex parabola drawn. In fact, it's a hyperbolic paraboloid, but you're seeing it in section. And this gives us a profile which cotangentally circumscribes the whole of the column and becomes the base. But in fact, it's not just one profile, it's 2 profiles. And as the column gets higher, these two profiles counter-rotate. So the column itself is that material which is in common to the blue and the green profile. So here is the 4-dimension played out. I feel this is not a good idea to, I would normally talk about this for an hour because it's just so sensationally rich as a philosophy for generating a surface so simple. 2 counter-rotated profiles, just as the column goes up, that's the 4th dimension playing out. Here you can see the column emerging. You might wonder what happens when it gets out of phase at the top. Well, I'll short circuit that one. The columns multiply, so then you get 2 profiles at the green and 2 at the blue. So this is what you'll see if I can just move this along a bit. This gets to the top out of phase, and I think you can get it. The same thing happens again. So you're getting a duplication of the profiles. I think this is extraordinary because it's like a cell division being enacted in the columns. First project to use a combination of manual drafting and digital stone cutting. This time we've gone to Holland. Actually, this predates the columns I showed you before, where we're using a saw making these cuts. A very painstaking process, even though the digital saw made things a lot quicker. We had robots on the Sagrada Familia before we had computers doing the designing. And here you can see it. And Senor Bonet Gary, the last director, made the decision to keep the texture of the saw as an honest manifestation of the technology that had been used to make these. I run a workshop in Barcelona at IAC, the Institute of Advanced Architecture at Catalonia, as part of my research, looking at what Gaudi would have done if he'd had access to these tools in his time. So we have these wonderful students taking on the paradigm and seeking to find ways to do this. And the Sala Craue is the first time where we actually have no evidence at all. Gaudi unhelpfully left us with this blank slate to work from. But any attic space in a Gaudi building, whether it's Belles Guard, a private house on the middle 2 on the left, or the Casa Miller on the right, there's no space too humble not to get the Gaudi touch. So that's why we gave it everything we could to make this auditorium, which is suspended in space. Light can come into the auditorium while people wait going to the top of the thing, and light can go through and through the vaults below. This is the first time we used what's called a shared digital model in the mid 2000s. I thought everybody would be doing that, but no, we're innovating in there again. CATIA being used for each one of these lines is a different part of the building being modeled parametrically by others in the team. We're able to bring in 3D printing. Yes, the first project of its kind to use 3D printing as part of the design toolkit, and we could actually produce print three separate designs in 1 week in order to assess this. This when I was asked by a esteemed colleague at RMIT to provide one photograph that summed up the Sagrada Familia, this is it. It's the fusion of every type of technology, old and new, original Gaudi models, 3D prints, we've got drawings, we've got digital a projection, and even provisional materials and photocopies, all being brought to make a very rich conversation. I love these. This was using our best resources in Australia for some virtual reality. And I'm pleased to report that while we can actually model glass and steel very well, we cannot model these spaces sufficiently well to give us an impression of what we're actually going to get. And here you can see is the outcome, nothing doing. Risk-taking because we had no way of calculating whether this space would be light enough. And it wasn't until the scaffolding was taken away 7 years later that we could see, in fact, it is light enough. So Gaudi, just to finish up, really, on the right-hand side, you can see, even with this advanced thinking around geometry, he was also very much a social person. He's representing the temptation of people into violence. This is the temptation of youth into anarchy by this strange creature that's offering a grenade in 1896. So if you look at the building in detail, you'll find that Gaudi wasn't just abstracting in the way the columns I just showed. He was actually hyper-realistic in some of the portrayals of the way. So these hyperboloids of revolution don't just finish at the Sagrada Familia. We've a number of projects where we've been looking at how they might be deployed in today, looking at surfaces and generally. Always this fusion of, this is a PhD workshop in Copenhagen, ran with Jane, where we're looking at building the biggest structure with the least amount of timber. And this is it coming up, and even the speculation that's, we call it dermoid, but the idea is that this is a structure which is bones that have grown organically with some kind of jellyfish skin that will, so this is us thinking about how we will go on to the future. Well, designing the digitalized city, last year, finally, architectural design had an issue called Designing the Digitalized City, where I was able to get all my heroes around the world to talk about what it is to be a city, what is the historical basis of a city, how do we capture data, and how do we analyze it to us of the future, and also how do we represent this. And so the issue identifies a section of internally resourceful visionaries who combine logistics and systems theory with the practical realities and challenges of mobility, sustainable materials, food, water, and energy supply, and water disposal. Crucially, they seek to ensure better urban futures and a civil and convivial urban experience for all city dwellers. I'm going to go through this very fast, but you can see just from these images, this is our memory and history. This is looking at resisting arrest by Thomas Daniel, the dynamic nature of contemporary architecture that just gives us a feeling of life. Tom Cavan at Melbourne previously, looking at how data can fundamentally inform design. Carlo Ratti, who has used data with a number of amazing tools, looking at cities as complex adaptive systems, deep diving into the unknown unknowns through AI and data, augmenting reality through data, thinking about communities and absolutely radically rethinking the way we live. The non-architect contributing to architecture. This is the former chief architect of Barcelona talking about the migration from digital cities to bio-cities. Refik Anadol, who had a marvelous piece at the NGV recently, who projects onto buildings to give a sort of a meta-narrative. Data-driven urbanism. This is Wen Yu He from Shenzhen, who has a team of 90, they can do things like go through all of Google Street View, capture the images, and using AI, work out the features and design buildings that absolutely match the neighborhood. Is that going to replace architects, we ask? Although this one, the contribution from Jane and Marcus from Swinburne, looks about what we're doing here to actually not have T-shaped people, but pie-shaped people, people with able to scope across disciplines, but also have at least two deep abilities, deep knowledge. So what about Melbourne and regional Victoria, and what are we going to do about it? There's the lovely bird's eye view of Melbourne. Ernst Fuchs wrote this book about Melbourne in 1946. He talks about cities where people have to walk 15 minutes or more to the nearest public conveyance. He's already describing the highways that get in the way. Melbourne, he says, shows all the features of a haphazard and uncontrolled sprawl. That's 1946, over 70 years ago. We knew where we were going, and he showed us in this amazing book. The continuous urban development extends to 32 kilometers from the center of the city at that point. There he is. He was an emigre. He was effectively looking at the city that would be the minute city, or the city where you could get to everywhere, the polycentric egalitarian that we all aspire to now. And here is the resource we have. This is the planning related entities within the Victorian government structure. We had to produce this, and shout out to Jeff Kim, our research fellow at the institute that we direct, Smart Cities Research Institute, for putting this together, because otherwise it is very difficult to understand who's making the decisions and why we are where we are. Now, this is a picture of the two dark grey are two key books. On the left-hand side is the X-ray, the City of 1946, and then there's Peter Seymour's book, 2019, it's called Breaking Point. And here are all the various plans that you can see that have been put together to help us move forward to a city that's always growing and seemingly exponentially. That's when I arrived in Australia, just before I arrived in 1996. You can see there's been a lot of great material that's been produced. Here are all the departments that you can see. Plus we have groups like Infrastructure Victoria who inform the minister directly. If you go through all that and then produce a word cloud to try and get a sense of priorities, one word that's missing from my point of view is the word design. Isn't that telling? Because that is what I think is missing. There's plenty of stuff going on now. We want to have desired outcomes. The Local Government Act of 2020 aims to ensure all Victorians have the opportunity to engage their council for the future of the community. In fact, it's mandated. We can see planning on a page. It's actually two sides of one sheet, but it's fantastic when you look at it. It's all there. It's telling us what we need to do, where we want to go, but I don't think it explains how we're going to do it. The act of this idea of community engagement, further word participation myself, engagement suggests that a power is allowing you to become involved with it, which of course that's probably how it is, but participation, I think from the citizens' point of view, is much more friendly. We're all in it together, because indeed we are. We don't have a single metropolitan authority for Melbourne, but we do have 6 partnerships. I really don't get it myself, but don't get this either. This is the contrast to the urbanity of central Melbourne and of Barcelona and Valencia, which I've shown you. This sprawl, this mycelium. On the left-hand side, there you can see the fertile gardens of Western Melbourne being literally taken over by this metastasis, which is the city. And it's not good enough. I'm a resident of West Melbourne. On the 2 shots on the left, you can see what happened in 15 years out of our window from the apartment. And you can see the contrast between night and day. We're trying to find a way to coexist the wonderful texture of Victorian Melbourne with the stuff that's happening behind. I'm not sure we can boast about the architectural merit of the tall buildings in the way that we can on the humble 2-story houses along Victoria Street there. There's heaps of stuff going on. There's not a lot of happy people around whether we're being consulted enough. I also get why it's so difficult. The urban loop, suburban loop, rail loop, if everybody knew where it was going, they'd be busy buying land to speculate. So that's apparently one of the reasons why it's been behind closed doors. But that seems to be in complete opposition to what we really want, which is citizens being involved. This is this week's Guardian. On Monday, the broken dream in Melbourne, people arrive making their affordable moves to affordable housing at the outsides of the cities, but not accessing schools that were promised, or even the railway station didn't appear. And this one, a follow-up on Western Sydney, all these dark roofs, which we've just learned since then have been banned because they're just great heat collectors. So where are we going? Well, Peter Seamer in Breaking Point, which is 2 years old, the Australian public needs to start demanding answers from the politicians. This can only happen if the public is aware of the issues and their potential solutions. Those involved in planning our cities need to bring these issues to everyone's attention. The need for localization should be center stage in any discussion about our cities. So just to wrap up, what's this got to do with a university? Because starting with just architecture itself, I've made a few cracks at architecture, but I have talked about Gaudi as this consummate genius, because he had all these. This is just a list of 32 of the disciplines that I think have to inform the training and the formation of an architect. Every one of those, it isn't just a half-hour YouTube video. It is a significant deep dive into those subjects, and that's just architecture. And then when you look at urban design, the urban design team, any one of these, you could say the planner or the social scientists or the designer or the economist could claim that actually they own the city, they own the future, they're the ones with the information that's most relevant. But of course, that's not true. But what we don't really know yet in the world that's changing, not just through COVID, but through the digitalization, is how do all these experts come together what is the leadership model for it? Within the university, that's all we can do. That's our boundary. So there are all those experts. Each one of those is one of our 65 cognate disciplines, which are represented here as part of 4 programs in the Institute. And just trying to work out how this should look. Obviously, if we just fuse it all together, we get this grey blob, and that's not what we want. We don't want that either. This is kind of lip service where we all pretend to talk to each other. What we really want is something where we're identifying our own disciplines. Each one of those colours is one of those disciplines, but it's in a swirl. Also, that's how you set up the conversation. But where do you have the conversation? Well, I'm talking to you from iHub, which is generously funded by Swinburne and the Australia Research Council in partnership with Monash, UQ, UNSW and Curtin, where experts and non-experts can get together and make decisions that affect the future. So I have a 3-minute video. I don't know if the sound will play. If it doesn't, I'll talk over the top. Maybe somebody put their hand up, Tom, if you can hear it. Thank you. So iHub is simply a facility where everybody can bring their visual information, whether it's photographs or what drives them mad, to an expert's graphs and tables, and put them up on the screen at the same time. It's not sharing the PowerPoint and taking your turn, it's having it all up. Super transparency from experts saying how they make the decisions, and from the participants from the community explaining what's important to them. It's only just finished. This is one of the first times it's been used, thanks to the lockdown. So we've been relying on these virtual images of it being used, but hopefully in a month or 2 we'll be able to post images of real people doing real things and thinking about the city and where it's going. And the last thing, artificial intelligence. This is a breakdown of the key components for architectural intelligence. This is the thing that we are having to embrace whether we want to or not. We're not necessarily seeing it as a threat. All the ones with the red are those which are directly have a direct contribution to make in this conversation. This is our message. This is our vision at Swinburne, where we're bringing people and technology together to build a better world. I'm echoing the Vice Chancellor's statement earlier. This is where we're going, and I hope you're seeing a fusion of this artificial intelligence and the space we're in. But there are some great books. This is a recent book by Robert Gordon, who explains why America is going backwards in terms of growth, and that technology isn't necessarily the answer. And Carl Benedict Frey from Oxford, and also a recent book, just a couple of years old, fantastic mixture of optimism framed around skepticism. The technology trap is where you actually have society resisting the technologies which seem to threaten their jobs or cause social unrest. So politicians and the people alike can actually collectivize to stop things happening. We don't want that to happen. Last word for Barcelona, they can take Serda's grid and modernize it by simply making a decision that through citizen participation, that the green roads will no longer have cars going over 20 kilometers an hour. It was 10, but through empirical observation, they needed to make it 20. Imagine that, and if we did that in Melbourne, just said that a large number of our roads are no longer drivable at above 20 kilometers an hour. Imagine Glenferrie Road, for instance. I gather Phil's here, he won't be very excited by that idea, but I think if you're a pedestrian and you're not dealing with the traffic management, as the council must do, it makes a much more livable city. So I hope I've made all those points in this record time. I know I'm over time. I just want to acknowledge Tom for his mentoring over many years. He didn't mention that he was on the advisory panel for a design research institute that I led at another university, and was such a dedicated and insightful advisor. Peter Newton, who was the lead partner for the iHub, where I am speaking from, shout out for Ornelly and Jeff, both doing PhDs with me, and will be in some ways bringing the AI and the space together. To the Smart Cities Research Institute program leaders, now 60 stream and theme leaders as the enlightened collaborators, our enlightened community. And finally, all the many collaborators whose work has not really been acknowledged because of shortness of time, not least, and my partner, Jane. Thank you.
Fantastic. That's an amazing presentation, Mark, and you covered an absolute mountain of territory. So can I invite people to put in questions they want to ask Mark into the Q&A? We've got a couple already, but I will start and take the chair's prerogative and ask my question first. So a lot of the great cities of the world, London, Barcelona, Paris, have often had a disaster happen, or maybe not a disaster, but they've had one person walk in and effectively design the whole city from almost a green field, like you talked about the fellow in Barcelona, and it was true of Haussmann and following the Great Fire of London as well. Is that what you need to have a really good urban design, or can Melbourne get there another way? I mean, I'm not planning on burning down Melbourne to get there, although that's a thought, but is there hope for us?
That's a great question, Beth. In a largely unrealized effort to pare back the talk, I mean, I kept wondering whether I should just do Gaudi or just do the city, but I really wanted to get it across. The bit that I pared away, however, was something about collective genius. So the subliminal message, because I hoped it would be subliminal, was that pre-digitally, we probably had to rely on the sole genius author like Gaudi or Haussmann for Paris or whoever. But I think the complexity of the modern city is such, and that's what the speed dating sort of at the end, going through all the composition of an urban design team. We need leadership, and I suspect that's political, but we need to have the experts up at the front, and they need to have a new conversation around combining their respective genius to make a collective intelligence. So I would worry about a single individual a visionary taking charge. I hope that we're all now mature enough in the digitalized world to have that conversation and recognize the contributions of others and not trend towards color gray, but actually get sparkling mutual excellence.
Terrific. Okay, so what I'll do is, unless people really want to read out their own question, I'll read them out from the Q&A box. So first one is anonymous. That's very modest of you. It says, great presentation. Have a lot of techniques that you've implemented become more widespread for construction? So do you want to talk about that one first?
Yeah, I wouldn't have put this material up for the oration if it wasn't because manifestly they have been taken up. So one of the good things about the Sagrada Familia is because it's such a publicly accessible building and high profile, it means that any innovation that has been visited on there, and the list is quite large. It's video conferencing. We've been using right from ISDN video conferencing to, the team that I've been with that based in the Antipodes to Barcelona hasn't wanted to move. So we found for 20 years that we could augment physical presence with virtual. The 3D modeling by 3D printing, rather, that was, again, we grabbed it from the engineers. They were using it for mechanical engineers. The parametric design, which is now the only way we work. First experiment with the Sagrada Familia, along with off-site fabrication. I mean, something I didn't have a chance to talk about was the Sala Creuer, which is that space, the big space above the center. That was entirely built, including the stone, off-site, and brought to site at night, and then hoisted up. And now, I mean, all those things are being done routinely. So the answer is yes. It is the source. It is the great living laboratory for digitalizing not only the representation of ideas, but the construction of them. And the second part of the question.
Yeah, how much of the Basilica sustainable design has been implemented into current design practices?
Very little, because the Sagrada Familia is a sustainable design that has to sustain itself for 1,000 years, which means that stone predominantly is the one material that we know will last at least 1,000 years. So unless you're making a stone building, there's not a lot that can be directly exported from the Sagrada Familia technologically. But every building that is involving stone, that doesn't, not just flat sheets of stone, are of course using the technologies there. But a lot of what we're doing in terms of so-called 3D milling, etc., are not directly translatable to industry, but they're indirectly translatable. And again, the fact that the building is so prominent, it's easy to access that information and draw insight from it.
Okay, so Jeffrey Robinson's asked, what are the biggest moves that we can make in the redesign of Melbourne to make it sustainable for our heating climate?
I love these short questions, which would probably require a lifetime to answer. My short answer is, I'm absolutely convinced that the only way we're going to get forward, this is why the Peter Seymour piece, which I skated over far too quickly, but policymakers are working to help the government of the day. And the worst of it is, it's what you can get away with. But the best of it is, it's exactly what people want. But people don't necessarily know what they want. They don't even necessarily know the challenges. You can see from our behaviors as a society, we don't, even when we've got clear and present danger, like a pandemic, we still find enough potty behavior to show that we're not actually able to be, I mean, this has really rattled me. I'd assumed before the pandemic that we would always recognize danger and our best side would come out. And it has largely. But I think for me, the answer is going to be helping the public understand what's at stake and understand what their contribution is. I don't want to be political about it, but obviously the less egalitarian we are as a society, the harder it is going to be to fulfill that. But that's what I think the answer is. We need to, and that's why I think iHub is going to be a great experiment in getting people around the table to learn what's at stake and collectively come up with some pathways to a sustainable future.
Fantastic, thank you. Ken McGuinness has asked, could you comment about the value of the second architect principle, where urban spaces are created by architects respecting each other's work? Do you know what the second architect's principle is?
Yes.
Okay.
So I'm not going to answer the question front on, but it does give me a chance to have a little chat about the role of the unenfranchised, unqualified designer, because that's something which I'm very nervous about. I have been a community architect in a former life before being an academic, where we did consult the public as best we could, and it was hopeless because they didn't know what they wanted and they didn't understand what we were offering. But if we put the pencil in their hands, it wouldn't have been a great outcome. So I think what we should be looking at is ways for architects not to try and elbow out the work of their peers or their predecessors, but to work with them, but not drop their own identity. There's no such thing as collective design. There's collective intelligence, but I wouldn't want to see collective design because I think that's one of the worst aspects of AI. But I think finding a way for architects to work together, to respect each other, to respect the past, to speculate on the future, and to use their skills to persuade the public that this is a good way to go. But there's a lot of work showing, I mean, Christopher Alexander and all those other stuff, Genius Loci and Norberg Schultz, and have looked at architecture without architects, and it's you just go to the latest James Bond film without doing any plot spoiling, but admitting that I have seen it at last. And you know, the first place that it has is an extraordinary town. I presume it's real. I just don't know where it is, what it is, but it's in Italy. And not a single architect was involved in putting that together. Yet a lot of architects, probably with small letters, were responsible for the pieces that come together, and somehow the rest maybe
Worked.
Yeah. So I don't know if that answers the question, but that's the best I can do on that one.
Okay, and last question, John Webb has asked, it said he's interested, oh there, where did John Webb go? Sorry, flicked on my screen. He's interested in your reference to the structure of bones. Some marine microorganisms have extraordinary shapes and morphologies. Do you see these biostructures as a source of imaginative designs for architecture? It's a suggestion, I guess.
I don't know how we'll get there, but that has to be the future. We have to grow our buildings. This won't happen in my lifetime, but we won't be able to. I mean, it's just logical. Forget all the mining Mars and planets and stuff. Just mining the Earth, we're not going to get the materials we need. So I think the organic route is going to be far more likely. I would be astonished if in 100 years' time buildings aren't growing themselves to the architect's design. And obviously, if we're going to be organic, why would you reinvent the wheel? I always think it's curious to look at nanobots building buildings when we've got things called termites, which at the moment they build termite mines because nobody's actually been able to tackle the pheromones system that they work on and corrupt them to actually build our buildings for us, because they make concrete out of saliva, cellulose, and locally resourced sand. So I think the bone-like structures, Gaudi was actually, you can see them on several buildings, not least the Passion facade, which I glossed over. We think the narrative was around the bones of martyrs, or in the Sagrada Família, the bones representing the death of Christ himself. But structurally, he had bones. There are photographs of bones and skeletons in his studio that survive. Not the bones, but the photos. So yes, I think that's I'm excited by it.
So look, there's one question I've missed. Can I just read out the question from Andrew Broffman? How might the emerging technologies you've spoken about support ecological urbanism approaches to city design, where there is less building and more restoration and integration of natural habitats and cultural landscapes?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question too. I mean, the answer to that is, well, it's another question, which is why aren't those things preternatural? We can go to other parts in the world. Barcelona is one of the cities where it's way ahead in terms of social sensitivity to ecology, to the past, to reuse of buildings. And we've got fantastic examples in Melbourne. I looked at the Guardian had a great distillation of the national awards for architecture this year. And when you look at it, it's so inspiring to see that much talent, but it's granular, and it shouldn't be granular. It should be mycelial. So I think it will happen if we can find a route to get the public to be more demanding of everything, including designers, and more responsive to good design. Then I think there is hope for that. I think the one good thing that's coming from the climate crisis is that we're being forced at every level, apart from one obvious few exceptions, but nearly everybody is actually being forced to confront the need for change and look for ways to celebrate our legacy through enjoying our past, and but be part of the speculation of how we make better futures.
And with that, I'd like to hand over to the Reverend Duncan Mccloud, who's going to do a vote of thanks. So fantastic. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Mark, for your inspiring journey with us. And it seems that you've been on a long journey yourself from your days in Christchurch. I'm a fellow Kiwi, through to your days in Cambridge and Barcelona, here in Melbourne. And the sense that you've drawn for us your interaction with a long history, the Barcelona city being 2,000 years old, and the impact of Gaudi over the last 2 centuries, really. We're so pleased to be able to get a sense, a taste of the inspiring work that you've experienced and taken part in and led in Barcelona. But we also are inspired today by that sense of a multidisciplinary community. It's said that it takes a village to raise a child. It takes a multidisciplinary community to design and grow a city that is sustainable, that is equitable and sustainable. I live only a few meters away from a point where the suburban rail loop is proposed to meet the green wedge over in eastern Melbourne. And of course, I am in a community that's very interested in consultation and design, innovation, and what that means for us. But I think we are all interested in what this might mean for us in our future. I really appreciated that you helped us think beyond 2030, 2050 to 2061, and maybe 2161, 2261. What is our design work and our urban futures going to look like as we work together? I work with Tom Spurling in his spare time, outside his innovation work in the university, but he never stops innovating. He's always on the lookout for ways in which we can work together. And I think that what you've been talking about tonight is an inspiration for how we think not just about the iHub you're developing there, but many more iHubs that will change the world around us. So thank you on behalf of everyone tonight for the way in which you have inspired us to think ahead and to bring together the world of Antoni Gaudí, technology and urban futures.
Thank you.
With that, I'd like to say thank you to everyone who's listened in tonight. Wish you all a happy rest of the year. This is our last event for the year. Hopefully we're going to go back to an in-person event next year, and so please come along to that in-person event and come and see the iHub. Maybe we'll have our next event in the iHub, Mark, with your permission. And thank you again. Congratulations to Tom, and thank you very much, Duncan, for the very lovely vote of thanks. And good night, everybody.